October 29th, 2025. Just 18 nautical miles off the coast of Oahu, the Russian spy ship Karelia is doing what it does best, pretending it's still 1985 and someone cares. Its surveillance antennas point skyward like a hedgehog having a bad hair day, electronic sensors humming away, convinced that today's the day Moscow finally gets valuable intelligence on Pearl Harbor. Spoiler alert, it won't. The Karelia is what happens when you take a Cold War relic, slap some upgrades on it, and call it modernized. In Russian naval terminology, modernized usually means they scraped off the rust, applied a fresh coat of gray paint, and zip-tied some off-the-shelf electronics to the superstructure. You know, the kind of cutting-edge equipment you can probably find on Alibaba with free shipping if you order in bulk. Inside this floating museum piece, 146 sailors are crammed into compartments that smell like diesel fuel, old socks, and regrettable career decisions. The ship's maximum speed? 16 knots. To put that in perspective, that's literally slower than a Honda Civic merging onto the freeway. My neighbor's electric scooter could probably keep pace. But standing on the bridge, the Russian captain doesn't care about speed. He's staring at his collection of antennas with the kind of pride you see in a guy who just discovered cryptocurrency. Convinced he's about to revolutionize everything, completely oblivious that he's walking into a disaster. He's thinking, today the Americans will panic. Today we collect everything. That confidence, that beautiful, unearned confidence, it's the same energy as someone who just started a podcast and thinks Joe Rogan is worried. Meanwhile, 2,400 miles away at Indo-Pacific Command headquarters, a watch officer glances at his screen showing the Karelia's position. He looks at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he picks up the radio. Prep an escort mission. We've got an antique wandering around out there. Looks like it forgot the way back to the Maritime Museum. This is the exact moment Russia's Cold War nostalgia trip turned into a masterclass in why you don't bring legacy hardware to a 21st century fight. The first American response wasn't a billion-dollar destroyer or a nuclear submarine. It was something far more insulting. A cargo plane. The HC-130J Super Hercules is the blue-collar workhorse of the US military. It's a design so reliable it's been flying in the various forms since Eisenhower was president. But don't let the vintage pedigree fool you. This isn't your grandfather's cargo hauler. This is a flying surveillance laboratory with a 15-hour loiter time and the kind of sensor package that makes Hollywood spy tech look like a kid's toy. Within 22 minutes of the Karelia being flagged, the Hercules was wheels up from Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. No dramatic scramble, no emergency klaxons, just a crew that grabbed their coffee, filed a flight plan, and launched into what would become the most one-sided intelligence collection mission since someone invented the internet. The Hercules established a lazy, almost insulting orbit at 8,000 feet directly above the Russian ship. From the deck of the Karelia, it was just a distant speck, engines producing a faint rumble. The Russian crew continued their work, logging frequencies, mapping ship movements, completely convinced they were the ones doing the spying. They had no idea they were the specimen under the microscope. Bolted to the Hercules belly is the NORALVAS-52 multispectral targeting system. Think of it as a camera pod on performance-enhancing drugs. It's gyro-stabilized, meaning every vibration from the engines, every gust of wind, every tiny aircraft movement gets canceled out in real time. The result is video footage so stable you could thread a needle with it. We're not talking about reading license plates from altitude. We're talking about zooming in tight enough to read the serial numbers on the Karelia's own surveillance. Antennas. From 2 miles up. The Russian crew thought they were collecting signals intelligence on American naval operations. The reality was far more embarrassing. The US Coast Guard was building a complete 3-dimensional, real-time intelligence profile of their ship, antenna placement, crew rotations, equipment types, structural vulnerabilities, and uploading it to Indo-Pacific Command every 30 seconds. The Russians were conducting espionage. The Americans were conducting a free audit. And Moscow was paying for it in fuel costs and national embarrassment. Aerial surveillance was clinical, professional, almost polite. What came next wasn't polite at all. Enter the USCGC William Hart, a Sentinel-class fast response cutter, which is Coast Guard terminology for small, fast, and absolutely done with your nonsense. The Hart didn't waste time with diplomatic niceties. It cleared its pier in Honolulu and immediately went to flank speed. Twin MTU diesel engines pushing nearly 6,000 horsepower through advanced water jets. This wasn't a ship plowing through waves. This was a 154-foot blade skipping across the surface like a stone thrown by an angry god. Within 58 minutes, it was on station. Now, the Russian captain had some tactical decisions to make. He could try to run, except his 1980s-era hull, designed for stability and looking vaguely intimidating in propaganda photos, topped out at 16 knots on a good day with favorable currents. The William Hart, meanwhile, could sustain 28 knots all day long without breaking a sweat. The math wasn't just unfavorable, it was humiliating. The Hart executed its intercept with the kind of precision that makes other navies weep. No radio hails, no warning shots. The cutter simply carved a tight, aggressive turn that would have been physically impossible for the lumbering Russian vessel and settled into a perfect escort position 400 yards off the Karelia's port beam. The message, delivered entirely through superior ship handling, was brutally clear. Your speed is irrelevant. Your maneuverability is a punchline. I'm here now. Get comfortable. For the first time that day, the Russian captain probably realized he wasn't starring in a spy thriller. He was the extra in someone else's training exercise. The Americans weren't scrambling to respond to a Russian threat. They were casually demonstrating what happens when outdated hardware meets modern operational doctrine. The Karelia wasn't being chased, it was being escorted, like a lost tourist being politely but firmly guided back to the airport after overstaying their welcome. The Russians thought they were projecting power. They were actually demonstrating exactly how much power they'd lost. Pinned, exposed, and running out of options, the Russian captain gave the order that would define his career for all the wrong reasons. Begin collection. It was a desperate gamble. A last-ditch attempt to salvage something, anything from a mission that was rapidly becoming a case study in how not to conduct naval intelligence operations. On the bridge of the Karelia, the signals intelligence crew probably felt a surge of purpose. Consoles lit up. Systems came online. Finally, they were doing what they'd sailed 5,000 miles to do. They thought they were hunting. They had absolutely no idea they were handing the Americans a complete owner's manual to their own ship. First, they activated their primary search radar, the MR-231. It's a broad, powerful pulse designed to map surface contacts across a wide area. For about 4 seconds, it probably felt like success. The screen is filled with targets. Contact after contact. Beautiful. Except on the HC-130 circling overhead, that radar signature wasn't just detected, it was instantly dissected, cataloged, and filed away. The American electronic warfare system didn't just see a radar pulse. It saw a fingerprint it had known for 30 years, complete with every diagnostic quirk and exploitable weakness. One down. Next, they brought up their high-frequency communications array, sweeping across hundreds of frequencies trying to intercept American naval traffic. Classic signals intelligence tradecraft, textbook execution, and it would have been impressive if the encryption wasn't so laughably outdated. The moment it transmitted, the American system flagged it as using a protocol so old it belonged in a museum next to rotary phones. It was the digital equivalent of locking your front door with a master lock from 1987 and thinking you're secure. 2 down. Finally, feeling confident, they activated their crown jewel, a specialized receiver designed to detect the faint electronic whispers of American stealth aircraft. It was supposed to be their ace, their secret advantage. But here's the thing about ultra-sensitive receivers: to calibrate properly, they have to emit a tiny identification pulse. Just a whisper. A technical necessity, and the Hercules heard it, logged it, archived it. 3 down. In less than 12 minutes of intelligence collection, the Russians hadn't gathered a single useful piece of information about American operations. Instead, they'd voluntarily handed over the complete electronic blueprint of their own vessel, frequencies, power outputs, encryption protocols, calibration signatures. They'd given the Americans the keys to the kingdom, and they never even realized the lock had been picked. After hours of being electronically strip-searched, the Karelia's mission ended not with a bang, but with the maritime equivalent of slinking away after getting caught shoplifting. There was no dramatic evasion, no clever countermeasures, just the quiet, humiliating reality of defeat. The HC-130, having completed what can only be described as a comprehensive digital autopsy, didn't even need to keep watching. The job was done. The Karelia simply turned its massive, lumbering frame northward and headed home. The Americans maintained visual contact, not because they needed to, but because it's simply good manners to escort your guest to the door after they've overstayed their welcome. Predictably, Moscow would spin this into a success story. State media would call it a routine intelligence gathering operation in international waters. Sure. And the Titanic successfully tested its hull's resistance to icebergs. Both statements are technically true and completely miss the point. But let's cut through the propaganda and talk about return on investment. Russia's investment, a 10,000-mile round trip. Weeks of fuel burned through engines older than most of the crew. Months of operational costs keeping 146 sailors fed, paid, and convinced this mission mattered. Shore support, logistics, diplomatic fallout. Conservative estimate, north of $500,000. The return, zero, zilch, nada. Unless you count the meticulously documented intelligence dossier, now sitting on American servers, complete with every frequency, every emission signature, every structural weakness, every exploitable vulnerability of Russia's premier signals intelligence vessel. America's investment, a few hours of flight time on a Hercules that's probably older than the Karelia's executive officer. Some fuel for a Coast Guard cutter whose engines barely broke a sweat. Total cost? Maybe $70,000, and that's being generous with the accounting. The return, a complete, searchable, high-definition intelligence package on a Russian strategic asset, delivered free of charge by the Russians themselves. This wasn't a victory in the flag-waving, chest-thumping sense. It was a transaction, a devastatingly, mathematically lopsided transaction that proved one simple truth. You can deploy your finest hardware halfway across the planet, but if your entire operation becomes a live training exercise for a Coast Guard plane and a single cutter, maybe the real intelligence failure wasn't in your sensors or your encryption. It was in the decision to sail out there in the first place. But here's where the story gets interesting. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was happening in a year when the Pacific was already a geopolitical pressure cooker. China testing boundaries in the South China Sea, North Korea launching missiles with the consistency of a subscription service, U.S. treaty allies quietly tightening their defense agreements like people checking locks before a storm. Russia, meanwhile, was trying to prove it still mattered. With its navy stretched thin and its economy limping along under sanctions, sending a signals intelligence ship into the Pacific wasn't just a mission. It was a statement. We're still here. We're still relevant. We still deserve a seat at the table. Except the message landed completely wrong. Instead of demonstrating reach, they demonstrated vulnerability. Instead of gathering intelligence, they provided it. And instead of unsettling the region, they accidentally reminded every Pacific ally, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, South Korea, that America doesn't need carrier strike groups to dominate the information battlespace. A Coast Guard plane and a single cutter are enough. Inside Allied defense ministries, the takeaway was unmistakable. U.S. surveillance isn't just efficient, it's omnipresent. And Russia's attempt at power projection had become a textbook example of how not to conduct naval operations in the 21st century. Even Beijing noticed, not publicly of course, but somewhere in a PLA Navy briefing room, analysts were updating their assessments, not of American strength, but of American casual competence, the kind that doesn't roar to make a point, the kind that dismantles geopolitical theater with a cargo plane and a cutter that normally enforces fishing regulations. For Russia, the incident would vanish from state media, buried beneath patriotic posturing and domestic propaganda. But inside their Naval Intelligence Directorate, the uncomfortable truth would linger. They'd traveled halfway around the world to prove something Moscow desperately wanted to believe, that the ocean still had secrets, that electronic warfare was still contested, that Russia could still compete. Instead, they proved the opposite. The ocean has never been more transparent. And the United States never needed to raise its voice to demonstrate who owns it. So here's the question. After this embarrassment, do you think Russia will try this stunt again? Or have they finally learned that sending Cold War relics to challenge 21st century surveillance is just expensive performance art?